October 1st, 2013, a public library in San Francisco. A 29-year-old man sat down, opened his laptop, and logged into work. He was chatting with a colleague, a fellow administrator, screen name Cirrus. Cirrus was a federal agent. A jury will need 3.5 hours. A judge will hand down 2 life sentences. And the last document in his case file, filed 11 years after that afternoon, is the reason this story does not end where you think it does. The website he ran could not be reached from a normal browser. It lived on the Tor network, its traffic, in a federal court's words, extremely difficult to trace. The play that afternoon was to bait the man into logging in where only the site's operator could go, an administrator page called Mastermind, and then take the laptop before he could close it. Court filings show it worked. Agents seized him mid-session, the undercover chat still open on the screen. The site was called Silk Road. The government put the drugs sold through it at $183 million. The username on the screen belonged to someone called Dread Pirate Roberts. The man at the table, a physics graduate, not one prior conviction, was Ross Ulbricht. In this file, a marketplace with no address, 2 federal agents who ended up defendants themselves, and a 2-page document signed at the White House. This is the file on Ross Ulbricht, on how one record can hold at the same time 7 convictions, none of them for violence, murder allegations that no jury ever weighed, 2 life sentences, and a full and unconditional presidential pardon. Ross Ulbricht. A physics degree, a master's in material science from Penn State, no prior convictions. By his own writings, what he wanted was a market outside the state's reach. Not a slogan, a working marketplace. Buyers, sellers, listings, reviews, for the things the law said could not be sold. In 2011, court filings show he built it and ran it under the username Dread Pirate Roberts. From the year the government first found the site to the afternoon of the library arrest, it could not put a name to that username. What happened in between, inside the market and inside the task force hunting it, is everything that follows. Here's the file. Per the record, Silk Road opened in 2011. It ran as a hidden service on the Tor network, and it worked like any marketplace you have ever used. Vendor pages, product listings, buyer reviews. What it sold was the difference. Court filings show that between 2011 and 2013, thousands of vendors moved approximately $183 million in illegal drugs through the site. That number is the government's own accounting, adopted in the pre-sentence report, not an independent audit, worth saying. It is also the only accounting the record we hold offers. Per the pre-sentence report, at shutdown, the site carried roughly 13,800 listings for controlled substances, 643 for cocaine-based drugs, 305 for LSD, 261 for methamphetamine. And not only drugs, court filings show Ulbricht allowed vendors to sell cyanide after being told it was a well-known poison for assassinations and suicides. Whatever the market's admirers said about victimless commerce, the record has that in it. The government found the site almost immediately. 2011, international packages with drugs inside intercepted at Chicago. 2 U.S. attorneys' offices opened parallel investigations, one in New York, one in Maryland. 2 teams, 1 username. Neither knew the man behind it. The New York team would eventually put a name to Dread Pirate Roberts. The Maryland team had a different problem. 2 of its own investigators were committing federal crimes of their own. January 2013. According to later reporting, and for this part of the story, reporting is what we have, a Silk Road support moderator in Utah, a man named Curtis Green, was arrested. The same reporting has him doing customer support for the site. What mattered was what his account could do. It held administrator credentials. What happened next comes from the government's own criminal complaint, filed against 2 of its own agents, both later pleaded guilty. The complaint alleged that Shaun Bridges, a Secret Service agent on the Baltimore Task Force, used Green's administrator account to reset user passwords, empty their Bitcoin wallets, and take $350,000, then let the blame land on Green. One wrinkle, and the record itself carries it. The complaint says Bridges took that money. But the government's own pretrial disclosure to Ulbricht had named the other agent on the task force, a DEA agent, Carl Force, as the one under investigation over that same stolen $350,000. 2 government documents, 2 names. The government's explanation: both men had access to the account. Keep the name Force, it comes back. In the chat logs the government put before the courts, Dread Pirate Roberts blames Green for the theft. According to the government's complaint, $80,000 then went from Dread Pirate Roberts to a man called Knob. What that money was for, a killing, is what the record alleges. It was never proven at any standard. Knob was an undercover identity belonging to Carl Force, the same DEA agent. Force staged the murder he had allegedly been hired to commit. Proof of death photographs went back to Dread Pirate Roberts. No killing happened. Maryland filed its own charging document over this episode, charges that were dismissed with prejudice and never tested in any court. An allegation in a charging document. Keep both of those words. We will come back to what happened to that document. Green, per that same later reporting and reporting alone, spent about the next year in hiding. His own court docket picks him up from there, sentenced to time served plus 4 years of supervised release. After that, the record barely mentions him. 2 agents, 1 staged murder, a marketplace still open for business, and an operator who still had no name. The name, when it finally came, so the New York Times would later report, came from a tax investigator with a search engine. The New York Times reported, 2 years after the fact, how the name first surfaced. Gary Alford, an IRS special agent working with the DEA, went looking for the earliest mentions of Silk Road anywhere on the open internet. In late May 2013, he found a forum post from the site's first days, a user called Altoid promoting the new market, and tied to that same username, an email address, rossulbricht@gmail.com. By the Times account, his supervisors initially brushed it off. Here is the strange part. The appellate opinion that reviewed this whole case never mentions Alford. The trial told a different discovery story, undercover infiltration and technical evidence. 2 accounts of how the government found its man, and no source in the record reconciles them. We flag it and move on. What the record does document is the infiltration. A Homeland Security investigator had worked his way inside the site's staff, operating the administrator account called Cirrus. On October 1st, it played out the way the cold open showed you. Dread Pirate Roberts baited into the mastermind page, taken mid-session, the laptop seized alive. Reporting at the time identified the library as the Glen Park branch. The next day, the government seized Silk Road's servers and shut the site down. Where the marketplace had been, there was now a federal seizure banner. And in Maryland, the same week, a sealed indictment got a name put on it. A grand jury there had charged a John Doe back in May. On October 1st, it superseded, naming Ross Ulbricht, and the counts included attempted witness murder and murder for hire. Charges. Allegations never proven at any standard. Remember them. What happens to them years from now is not what you'd guess. New York went first. The government had its man, his laptop, and his site. The trial that followed was about drugs, hacking, and money, not murder. Keep that distinction in view. The whole file turns on it. United States v. Ulbricht went to trial in Manhattan in January 2015 before Judge Katherine Forrest. 7 counts. Per the indictment, narcotics distribution, charged 3 ways. Running a continuing criminal enterprise, the statute known as the Kingpin Statute. Computer hacking conspiracy. Conspiring to traffic in fraudulent identification documents. Money laundering conspiracy. Read that list again. There is no murder in it. There is no violence in it, anywhere. The violence entered the courtroom anyway, as evidence. The government alleged that Dread Pirate Roberts had commissioned the murders of 5 people to protect the site's anonymity, and the appellate opinion would later state there is no evidence any occurred. New York never charged him with any of it. Maryland's 2 counts sat untried in another courthouse. The appellate opinion says so in terms. Ulbricht was not charged in this case with crimes based on ordering these killings, although evidence relating to the murders was introduced at trial as actions taken in furtherance of the charged conspiracies and criminal enterprise. His defense was, though the jury rejected it, that he had created Silk Road, sold it in 2011, and been lured back at the end to take the fall for the real Dread Pirate Roberts. The defense pointed at other candidates for the name, men the government had already investigated and ruled out. And there was an argument the jury never got to hear. By the time of trial, Carl Force, the agent from Chapter 2, was under grand jury investigation. The district court barred Ulbricht from putting Force's corruption before the jury to protect that investigation. Bridges' corruption he did not learn about at all until after the verdict, when the complaint against the agents was unsealed. For the record, both agents were convicted on their own guilty pleas. Force, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and extortion, 78 months. Bridges, money laundering and obstruction, 71 months, plus 24 more months consecutive on a second case, 95 months total. Ulbricht would raise all of it afterward as a fair trial claim. Hold that thought, the court's answer is coming. The jury got the case on February 4th, 2015, and came back the same day, about 3.5 hours. Guilty, all 7 counts. The verdict settled what he had done. The sentence would turn on something else entirely. The 5 murders for hire no jury had ever weighed. The sentencing hearing came at the end of May 2015. It is the hinge of this entire file. Because Ulbricht contested his responsibility for the commissioned murders, the sentencing judge had to resolve the question, under the standard sentencing law allows, a preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The sentencing court found, by a preponderance of the evidence, that Ulbricht did commission the murders, 5 of them, believing they would be carried out. The court characterized the evidence, his journal, his chats, and payment records showing $650,000 in Bitcoin as ample and unambiguous. Yet the same appellate record states, in terms, there is no evidence that any of the murders actually occurred. The government's own theory was that the supposed hitman, a username Red and White, was a scammer who tricked Dread Pirate Roberts into paying for killings that were never carried out. The record we hold puts no real name to any of them, not the supposed hitman, not the intended victims. 3 usernames, Red and White, Friendly Chemist, Tony76, and then the record simply stops. On appeal, Ulbricht did not challenge the finding that he commissioned them. That is not a footnote. It is why the finding still stands. The sentence? 2 life terms, plus 5, 15, and 20 years, all running concurrently. Inside the life terms, not stacked after them. Lifetime supervised release. A forfeiture judgment of $183,961,921. The sentencing transcript records the judge telling Ulbricht, it was, in fact, a carefully planned life's work. It was your opus. And, 1 sentence later, you wanted it to be your legacy. You said that in some of the communications introduced at trial. And it is. And it records Ulbricht's own words to the court. I wanted to empower people to be able to make choices in their lives for themselves and to have privacy and anonymity. There was more in the sentencing record. 6 deaths. 6 people whose drug-related deaths were connected in the pre-sentence materials to drugs bought on Silk Road. The court found a connection and expressly declined to find that Silk Road drugs were the but-for cause of any of those deaths. A defense expert contested the linkages. The deaths were real either way. Ulbricht's side argued the site reduced harm, but the court's answer was that the site expanded the market. The fair trial claim from Chapter 4? He raised it. Court filings show he moved for a new trial, arguing the government had withheld evidence it owed the defense. The corruption he learned about only after the verdict, a Brady violation in the law's term. But the court said no, motion denied, denial affirmed, trial stood. His position, that a jury who knew what those agents were might have seen it differently, remains the minority view. Live, both agents really were convicted, but rejected. From there, the doors started closing. May 31st, 2017, the Second Circuit affirmed in all respects. June 28th, 2018, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. With that, the conviction was final. Which is why, 3 weeks later, Maryland finally moved on those 2 violence counts from 2013. Court filings show the charges were dismissed on the government's own motion, with prejudice. Gone for good, they can never be refiled. The motion states its reason on its face, and the reason is that finality. The defendant is currently serving a life sentence arising out of a conviction in the Southern District of New York. Said conviction and sentence have been affirmed on appeal, and the Supreme Court denied a petition for writ of certiorari. Read it closely. That is the whole of the reason the motion gives. The government said it was dropping the charges because he was already serving life. It said nothing about whether it could have proven them. That silence is real, and it is a silence the record we hold does not fill. A last petition, habeas, filed in 2019, was denied in 2022 with no certificate of appealability. The forfeiture order went final in February 2023. By 2023, the case was, in every legal sense, over. The next document filed on that docket did not come from a lawyer or a judge or a prosecutor. It came from the White House. January 21st, 2025. The President of the United States signed a 2-page document that was filed on the Silk Road docket as entry 403. Be it known that this day I, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States, have granted unto Ross William Ulbricht a full and unconditional pardon. Full, unconditional. The warrant reads that way in so many words. The document designates the pardon attorney to sign the grant as the President's representative. According to contemporaneous reporting, the President announced it himself that same day after a phone call with Ulbricht's mother, following years of advocacy, including a senator's letter urging clemency on sentencing disparity grounds. After roughly 11 years in custody, Ross Ulbricht walked out a free man. No supervised release, no sentence left to serve. Since his release, he has appeared publicly, including a keynote at a Bitcoin conference in Las Vegas that May. 2 things the record we hold does not answer, so neither will we. What a full and unconditional pardon does to a $183 million forfeiture judgment that had already gone final. Press accounts describe a resolution, but we could not locate a primary record of it, so the reported numbers stay out of this episode. And whether the government's stated reason for dropping the Maryland charges was its whole reason. The motion gives one reason. No record we hold speaks to any other. That is an absence of evidence, not a mystery. What we know, plainly stated, he built Silk Road and he ran it. His own defense conceded the building. He was convicted of 7 federal crimes. Not one of them was a crime of violence. The public record shows he was never tried, anywhere, on any charge of ordering a killing. New York never charged one. Maryland charged 2, and dismissed both untested for a stated reason that says nothing about their strength. As for the killings themselves, in the appellate court's words, there is no evidence that any of the murders actually occurred. Yet a federal judge found, by a preponderance of the evidence, a finding he did not challenge on appeal, that he commissioned 5 of them, believing they would be carried out. He has not been silent. His positions are extensively on record, in his trial submissions, his appeals, and in interviews and public statements since the pardon. What the record we hold does not contain is a direct response from him to that finding specifically. The closest is what he told the court at sentencing. That finding is still sitting in the record. The pardon lifted the punishment. It did not erase the finding. 2 life sentences, and now a pardon. The same docket holds both. What really happened to Ross Ulbricht is not a verdict reversed, and not a mystery solved. It is a record that holds all of it at once. And now you've read it. That's the file. The sources are in the description. Every court filing, document, and primary article we used. If you want to audit the work, you can. If you want the next file when it opens, subscribe. Closing the file.